2024 is the start of a new era for the AFL because for the first time since 2014, the league will have a new CEO. Andrew Gillon is taking over from Gillon McLachlan, whose last year's resignation saw an end to a nearly 10-year-long career as the AFL's frontman. During his time in the top job, the AFL saw many changes, including a great number of rule changes and adjustments. So with the 2024 season approaching, I decided to look back and see just how the game evolved under McLachlan's leadership. Now obviously I understand that his job as the AFL CEO was more than just changing the rules. There were obviously a great many other things behind the scenes that we didn't see that Gillon McLachlan was doing, and obviously other people under him would have had a role in changing the rules. However, I still thought it would be a fun idea to look back at how the game changed in the 10 years that he was in charge. So without further ado, let's look back at every single rule change made under the leadership of Gillon McLachlan. Because McLachlan's career as the AFL CEO started a month into the 2014 season, we aren't going to look at any of the 2014 rule changes, so we're going to skip straight to 2015, where there were a total of 2 rule adjustments. The 2 changes going into the 2015 season were fairly simple and didn't change the way the game was played too much. All that was changed was that there was a bit of an update into the way that blocking in a marking contest and the holding the ball rule were adjudicated.
As well.
All right, what about this one with Daniel Wells taking into account the new interpretation?
So once again in this one, what we see here is Elliott, who comes across in front of Wells, takes his eyes off. Wells is going to attempt to go and contest the mark, is not allowed to by Elliott, and so therefore that is a free kick and should have been paid last year. So this is the real interpretation that we're going to be looking at for this year. What we see here is Thurlow guides or moves Langford off his line. So if you go back to the cues of the umpire, that's what Thurlow is trying to do. He's trying to stop Langford from contesting the mark in a 2v1 situation. So that will be the free kick in 2015.
The 2016 season had a number of rule changes. A couple of them were simply just adjustments to the way already existing rules would be adjudicated. For example, there was a stricter interpretation on free kicks being paid for dangerous tackles and deliberate out of bounds. But there was also a few more impactful changes. Perhaps biggest of all was the change to the way the interchange system worked in 2016. Previously, from 2011 to 2015, teams were allowed 3 interchange players each match with 1 substitute. However, the substitute rule in 2016 was scrapped due to negative feedback from the players, and instead teams were allowed 4 regular interchange players. The number of rotations a team was allowed was also changed. Previously it was 120, but in 2016 that number was slashed to just 90. The AFL did this to free up congestion in the game and attempt to increase scoring. The other rule changes that were brought in for the 2016 season were the increase of the protected zone for a mark or free kick from 5 metres to 10 metres, as well as one rule which never came into effect, and that was the abolishing of the grand final replay, instead replacing it with extra time. Still to this day, another grand final draw has not occurred, so the extra time rule has not come into play in the last 7 years since this rule has been in place. Perhaps the most bizarre rule change was one that actually happened mid-season. The genesis of the change was a round 7 match between North Melbourne and St Kilda, where in the dying moments of the game, Mason Wood won himself a free kick while North Melbourne were 1 point up, when he proceeded to waste the final 30 seconds of the clock before slotting through a goal. The time wasting had no bearing on the result of the game. However, after that point in the season, the AFL decided to remove the set shot clock, which tells you how much time you have left to kick the ball in the final 2 minutes of every single game. This change was abolished after the 2016 season. However, umpires are hotter on time-wasting tactics in front of goal. The 2017 season saw just 3 rule changes. 2 of them were just little minor tweaks to the way rules were adjudicated, those being the deliberate out of bounds rule and also the high contact rule in tackles. The umpires were told to focus more on players who are trying to draw high free kicks by ducking or lowering themselves into the tackles. But there was also a change to the way ruck contests work. No longer were teams allowed to bring a third man up to the ruck contest. Now teams had to nominate one ruckman to contest in the stoppage. If a third man up contested the stoppage, then a free kick would be awarded against the offending team. Or if the ruckman contesting the stoppage did not nominate themselves, then a free kick would also be paid. In a bit of a change of pace, 2018 was a season which saw no rule changes or adjustments to the way rules were adjudicated at all. This came as a breath of fresh air for some fans. However, unfortunately for them, the attitude of letting the game evolve naturally would not remain much longer. 2019 was a season which saw 9 rule changes, and some of these rule changes were probably the most significant we've seen in this video so far. The biggest change of all was the 666 rule, which dictated that at the start of play during a game and at every centre bounce, teams must have 6 players in every section of the ground, the midfield, forward line and back line. 4 players must be inside the centre square with 2 players on each of the wings, and of course there would be 6 players in both the forward line and back line for each team. Previously, teams could flood the forward line or back line during the ends of games. However, this was no longer the case. The AFL made this rule change in an attempt to free up congestion, and it worked to a degree. However, probably not as much as they were hoping, but most fans would agree that this was a positive change regardless. The next rule change for 2019 was regarding kick-ins. Players were no longer required to kick to themselves to play on from the defensive goal square, and the man standing the mark of the kick-out, who previously had to stand 5 metres outside the goal square, now was moved back to 10 metres outside the goal square. Similarly, when a defender took a mark or received a free kick within 9 metres of their own goal, the man on the mark would be brought back to the top of the line of the goal square, where previously they were only to be standing a few metres out from the boundary line where the free kick was paid or mark was taken. There was also a little bit of a crackdown on umpire contact. Players were no longer able to set up behind the umpire at centre bounces. This was to avoid the umpires running backwards into players and getting knocked over. Another rule change, when 50-metre penalties were handed out, players could now play on from the 50-metre penalty, take advantage while the 50-metre penalty was being measured out, and if the man who was supposed to be manning the mark infringed upon this, then another 50-metre penalty would be paid. Players were now allowed to kick around the body when they were taking a shot for goal after the siren. However, they must kick the ball directly in line with the man on the mark and the goal. There was a slight tweak to the push in the back rule, or rather the hands in the back rule. Players could now place their hands in the back of an opponent to protect their position in a marking contest. However, they were still not allowed to push their opponents in the back. There was also a change to ruck contests. If a ruckman grabbed the ball out of the ruck and was tackled immediately, that would no longer be considered prior opportunity, and it would no longer be a free kick for holding the ball. Previously, if a ruckman grabbed it and was tackled straight away, that was just considered prior opportunity. Now they had to grab it, and if they had time to dispose of it quickly before they were tackled, then it would be called holding the ball. But if it was just a grab and then a tackle straight away, it would just be another ball up. The final rule change, and probably the most controversial and the strangest rule change out of all of these, were that team runners were no longer able to run out onto the field whenever they wanted. This was because of an incident involving a runner being out on the field for an extended period of time in one of the games of the 2018 season. Now runners were, and also water carriers, were only allowed to enter the playing surface after a goal had been kicked, and they must exit before play restarts. This ended up being a very unpopular rule among players and coaching staff, and it was scrapped and altered slightly the following season. 2020 was the year that the world was plunged into chaos by the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was a year of much confusion for the AFL, with many changes to the way the 2020 season would be played. However, there was only one rule change, which was the reducing of quarter lengths from 20 minutes with time on to 16 minutes with time on. This was done to ease the pressure off players and reduce the workload of players, because obviously players were having to stay in hubs and had restricted opportunities to train. This change of the quarter lengths was only a temporary one, and it was only used for the 2020 season. It was never going to be a permanent change. The following season, quarter lengths were back to their standard 20 minutes with time on, with no other permanent rule changes being made for the 2020 season. 2021 was a big year for rule changes in the AFL. There were 4 in total, not including the quarter lengths going back to 20 minutes. The number of interchanges a team was allowed per game was slashed from 90 to 75. The player defending kick-ins was pushed back a further 5 metres, so now the man on the mark would be 15 metres away from the goal square as opposed to 10 metres like previously. The AFL brought back the sub this season, although this time it was a little bit different. Instead of just being an all-round sub, this was specifically a medical sub, and unlike previously when they tried this rule, they did not remove a man on the bench, so now teams still had 4 players on the bench, but they also had a medical sub which they could use when a player got injured. But the biggest change of all was the new man on the mark rule, or rather the stand rule. This new rule meant that whenever a player was manning the mark, they were no longer allowed to move laterally, otherwise a 50-metre penalty would be paid. This rule was an attempt to speed the game up, and for a little while it did look like it was working. In the first few rounds of the 2021 season, games looked a lot more open, the scoring increased, and overall it seemed like the speed of play was much more fast-paced. However, over time, coaches and teams have worked out how to get around this rule and set up their defensive structures better, so it has not really had a whole lot of impact on the AFL. Moving to 2022 now, and there were only 3 rule adjustments for the 2022 season. However, there was still a little bit of controversy caused by one. The first 2 really didn't change much at all. There was just a slightly stricter interpretation of the holding the ball rule. Once again, we saw this earlier in the video, but essentially nothing really changed there. And also umpires were told to more closely monitor time-wasting tactics and punish players for time wasting sooner rather than giving them so many warnings. The final rule change was adding in a new umpire dissent rule. This basically meant that whenever you showed discontent with a decision towards the umpire, then they had every right to pay a 50-metre penalty. This caused a lot of controversy throughout the year and the following year as well in 2023. They did loosen up on it a bit at one stage during the season. However, there was still many contentious moments where players seemingly just put their arms up in the air, didn't even really say anything towards any of the umpires, and yet that was enough to be paid a 50-metre penalty. Previously, there was an abuse rule where you could give away a 50-metre penalty by abusing one of the umpires. However, this rule really took that to the extreme, and while some umpires are more lenient than others, typically this rule was enforced very strictly.
Thomas can't believe it. 50 metres, umpire dissent.
And now we move on to 2023, which was Gillon McLachlan's final year as the CEO of the AFL. And it was a pretty uneventful year in terms of the rule changes. There was only 3, and all 3 of them were pretty basic. Players now weren't able to milk 50-metre penalties for the stand on the mark rule. Previously, players could fake a handball, and that may cause the player on the mark to step sideways, thinking that they're going to handball the ball, and then that would draw a 50-metre penalty. However, if players faked handballs and the standing player on the mark moved because of that, then there would be no 50-metre penalty paid. The umpire would just reset the mark and play would continue as normal. And another one relating to the stand rule, players now standing the mark couldn't leave the protected area once they stood the mark. Like, they couldn't just stand momentarily and then leave the protected area to move back and guard a bit more space, as that was a tactic employed over the previous couple of years to try and get around the new stand rule. And finally, when players were lining up for set shots, they'd still have the full 30 seconds to go through their routine, but previously umpires would give warnings after 15 seconds and 25 seconds. Now there was no more warning at the 15-second mark. There was only a warning when there was 5 seconds left to go. But none of these changes really changed much in terms of the way the game was umpired and played. That brings us to the end of Gillon McLachlan's career as the AFL CEO, and also to the end of the video. Definitely a longer video than what I've been used to making the last year or so, but that is the nature of the AFL and shows just how many rule changes there have been over the last decade or so. So with that being said, I hope you did enjoy this video. Let me know what you thought about this style of video in the comments below, and also how many of these rule changes you agree or disagree with. And of course, if you did like the video, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.